We now turn to our keynote session. We have an honor to welcome Dr. Marc Saxer, who is the head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FES, Office for Regional Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Earlier, he was the head of the FES Asia Pacific Department in Berlin and represented the foundation in India and in Thailand. Dr. Marc is a political analyst, strategist, and writer. Dr. Marc's work focuses on geopolitics, geoeconomics, international order, transformation, and democratization processes. His work has been published in more than 20 languages and was featured in major news outlets around the world. His book, Transformative Realism: How to Overcome the Systematic Crisis, was published in 2022. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Saxer, our keynote speaker, to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. When the organizers asked me to do this, I looked at the program and I said, I don't know anything about health, so I think you have the wrong guy. And they said, don't worry about it, because half of the program is about the change of the global landscape. So we're going to focus on that. Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Sampan, talking about the red team and the blue team and what the kind of disruptions they are creating and what kind of impact that is going to have not only on global trade, but pretty much on the entire system. We do have to keep in mind that geopolitical competition, great power, rivalry means war. And there is a lot of war already happening after the end of Pax Americana, after the end of the unipolar moment, after the decline started of US hegemony. We see a full-fledged war in Europe, where I'm from. We see wars ravaging the Middle East. We see wars all over Africa, the Caucasus, all the way to South Asia, and here, actually, in this region. We need to keep this in mind. But we also see that in this region, where we are right now, East Asia, Southeast Asia, there seems to be a very fragile stalemate, a certain kind of pact between China and the United States. There's reasons for that. I could go into that. I think for now it's enough to say that if this lasts, then the geopolitical competition, the hegemonic competition between the United States and China will be fought on the battlefields of economy and tech. So that means geoeconomics is actually the name of the game, at least in this region. I very much hope it stays like that. There's always a looming danger of a hot war. But for the time being, I think we're looking at a situation that I don't really like to call a Cold War, because that's already misleading. The old Soviet Union was never as economically powerful and interdependent with the global economy as China is. So it's not the same thing, but I'm talking about the Cold War in terms of intense geopolitical competition and the absence of a great power or even nuclear war. So what do we see already and where is this heading? Of course, we see the politicization of market access. That's actually a trade war. China has always been doing this in the sense that accessing the Chinese market has always been political, and it's become more difficult recently for international corporations to operate within the Chinese market. What the Trump administration has been adding to this is that basically the US has declared it no longer wants to be the consumer of last resort, which is the main engine that's been driving economic globalization as well as the entire world economy over the last 50 years, and is actually rewriting the international trade and economic order with this tariff war and all the other protectionist measures that are being put. That means, in political terms, to enter the US market, you have to pay a price, either in US dollars, in terms of tariffs, or politically, because there will be asks that you will have to fulfill. Others are following suit. You can see same tendencies what the European Union is doing. Japan and South Korea are doing it. So that's a trend that the open trading regime is coming to an end. We see a protectionist wave, and I think this is one of the things to say. This is accompanied within geoeconomic competition by, at least in the West, China always did this, East Asia always did this, a resurgence, a weaponization almost of industrial policy. They're all doing it, and if everyone is doing the same, identifying the technologies of the future, putting state subsidies into place, pushing from, the state is actually pushing the champions of the future and so on, it means that we're going to produce overcapacities, collectively actually, but of course the finger pointing versus right now is vis-a-vis China, and the question is what happens with all these capacities, and we're going to see price wars, and we can see dumping, and we're going to see pressure on the markets where these overcapacities go. Geoeconomic competition, but also geopolitical competition, is about tech, because tech is to believe to be the decisive factors in the wars of tomorrow. Artificial intelligence, of course, is being pushed as much as it is as the moonshot of our day, because it is believed to be decisive in the next wars. But it also has trickle-down effects geoeconomically, because it basically changes everything from the way we organize labor to markets to supply chains to the entire technological backbone of our world. Because it is organized as a rivalry, because there is geoeconomic competition, there is a tendency towards bifurcation, meaning that the tech worlds, in the worlds of Kun Sampan again, could fall into a red tech world and a blue tech world, and they would be no longer compatible. So what we've been accustomed to, that the phone you have in front of you on the table works everywhere, is increasingly no longer the case, both in the worlds of hardware as well in the software, and that will actually add high cost to the rest of us, opportunity cost for the rest of us, because to be operational in two incompatible worlds will actually extol a high price, and it's kind of a decision where it's really hard to go back on. Once you go on path one world, it's really difficult to unwind that. It's very similar to weapons procurement, it's very similar to energy supplies. Once you're in, it's difficult to change team. At the same time, there is an acceleration of digital automation, which means, and I'm going to come back to that later, one of the other driving factors of globalization over the last 40 years was cheap labor. And now we're basically replacing human labor with algorithms, with robots, with artificial intelligence, and that is undercutting the competitive advantage of cheap labor. That means, and it enables, because the cost is sinking, the efficiency is increasing, but also the geopolitical competition is driving it, that you will see, and you are seeing already, a reorganization of the global supply chain system. That's all the friendshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, offshoring, backshoring, whatever shoring. It means the infrastructure, the global supply chains that have been super interdependent over the last 40 years is reorganized, reconfigured in a way that is maybe more resilient, that is maybe also geopolitically more resilient, because you don't want to put your eggs in a basket where you don't know where that basket is going. But it means down the line that you will find yourself in a completely different ecosystem of supply chains, and that is obviously a major disruption. Finally, we see de-dollarization or not, we see currency wars going on. Of course, the BRICS nations and others have been seeing increasingly disillusioned the way that the US is weaponizing its currency. The US dollar is the global reserve currency. It is the global trade currency. So that means you have control over the US financial market, which is the biggest and the deepest in the world, and you have control over your currency. You can exert pressure and control over others. And the US has increasingly been using this kind of weapon in order to get its political will. The freezing of the U.S. assets in the Russian assets in the Ukraine war will be just the last chapter of that book. So what the BRICS have been trying to do is to say, well, maybe we need more competition, we need our own currency, we need our own SWIFT system, we need our own infrastructure and plumbing. Hasn't gone so far. I think that's not really the story. What is actually happening is that the U.S. has over-weaponized its currency. The U.S. has gone deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. We have a double deficit, and the Trump administration and the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord has now the policy goal to drive down the value of the US dollar. That is a very sensitive operation, because what they want to do is, on the one hand, weaken the dollar, but not so much that it ceases to be the international reserve currency and ceases to be a weapon of geopolitical coercion. It's a very fine line to walk, and I would say there's lots and lots of question marks if that can ever work, and it makes you vulnerable. Because if you need to refinance, I think this year it's 6 or 7 trillion US dollars in sovereign debt, and you're at the same time alienating the buyers of that sovereign debt, you put yourself in a squeeze. And I think that is a pretty fragile position to be in. So the bonds market, the treasury market, is actually something that we need to watch in order to see how healthy others think the US actually is. And I think a government shutdown doesn't really add a lot of confidence to this kind of question. So lots and lots of changes. I could go on. That list is just an example here. There is many more to come. But I think if we sum it up, we see that the age of neoliberalism, the free flow of goods, of services, of capital, of people, of labor, of ideas, is over, is no longer the policy of the liberal hegemon, is no longer what we see around the world. We see a return of the state, the security state actually, over the market. We see the primacy of national security returning over economic interest, over economic efficiency. We see the paradigm shift from efficiency or just-in-time delivery towards resilience, which means just in case. We see that the home market becomes increasingly important and stonewalled vis-a-vis the activity of going into more and more export markets. And we see that coercion is increasingly replacing the logic of interdependence. Please remember, not long ago, the idea that economic interdependence creates peace was the paradigm of the neoliberal age of the time from the 90s to the early 2000s. The more we trade with each other, the more we cooperate with each other, the less the chance that we go to war with each other. That logic seems to have flown out of the window, and we see a weaponization of trade, of technology, and finance. As I said, maybe the most disruptive thing that we're going to read in the history books in 50 years or something like that is that the US ceases to be and refuses to be the consumer of last resort. And frankly speaking, all of the conferences where I'll go, where I talk to people in the business community, but also in the geopolitical community, no one has any idea how to replace that. So that means we're going into a world that is more fragile, more fragmented, and more prone to shocks and crises. Don't want to really call it deglobalization, because I think we're going to stay interconnected. There is still a global economy, and we need a global economy. But I think it's going to be less so, and I think the paradigm has shifted already and will continue to do so. This means if you're looking from this part of the world, if you're looking from the perspective of a developing country in particular, which Thailand no longer is, then you're going to have a huge problem. Because the only economic development model that ever worked is the flying geese model. The idea that cheap labor, export-led growth, and catch-up industrialization is going to propel you up the global value chain, and that is how you develop. And that worked beautifully fine for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and now South Asia. The problem is that all of the geoeconomic disruptions that I just named are undercutting this model. Automation, digital automation is undercutting, as I said earlier, the comparative advantage of cheap labor. Export-led growth is not possible if you go into a protectionist world. Your markets are freezing up, they're closing down. And catch-up industrialization means that you have to move up the global value chains, which is difficult if you're being out of the friend zone. You have to have technology transfer, which is difficult if technology is weaponized, and you want to industrialize. And that is actually difficult if overcapacities or dumping prices are entering your market. So we're actually looking at de-industrialization in large parts of Southeast Asia. So that means the old development model is obsolete, and we haven't found a new one. And I think this is where we stand, and that's an urgent question to discuss. At the same time, geoeconomics is not everything. Geopolitics also creates the legal framework, the multilateral architecture that has actually shored up this multilateral world, this liberal world order as we've seen it. This is pretty much how it looks like. I think maybe this picture I drew 2 or 3 years ago is probably worse now. You see that whatever we call the liberal world order, and I know this is a charged concept, some people would say there never was a liberal world order, whatever it was, number one, it's being contested because China and Russia, but also the global south, are not satisfied with how it's going. They're not represented according to the power they have in the system in the 21st century. They're saying this has been built in 1945. It's not what we built. You want to uphold the rules, but whose rules are they? You did them. We haven't been asked. But at the same time, the Trump administration is now putting the wrecking ball to it. You see, if you look at it from the perspective that the liberal world order has 3 pillars: a liberal mission to promote democracy and human rights, a liberal economic order of free trade, basically, and a multilateral global governance structure. The Trump administration has been putting the wrecking ball to all 3 of them. Just to name a few of these wrecking balls, this dissolution and cutting down of USAID, I think, is a sign that the US is no longer interested in promoting democracy and human rights as part of their foreign policy. The tariff war, of course, is a direct attack. It's meant to be a direct attack on the open liberal economic order. And the US withdrawal from half a dozen UN organizations, from the WHO, which you're going to discuss here, from the abandonment of the WTO, etc., the COP climate agreement, and so on, of course means America first doesn't want to play multilateral anymore. It wants to play unilateral because the US believes this is where it has the most advantages. And all of that summed up means that the liberal hegemon who has created and guaranteed the international order for 80 years has declared it obsolete. And that's where we stand, and we don't know what that means. We see the effects, though. We see that geopolitical competition, great power rivalry is paralyzing multilateral institutions. I think the WTO is a good example. The WHO is a good example. And we see that, of course, countries that still want to cooperate try to find replacements which are not just good, but maybe the only game in town. So that's the whole minilateral, plurilaterals, bilaterals, that we're seeing countries working together on certain issues, at least to get some collective action going, but it's not the same thing as a global multilateral order, and it maybe also doesn't have the same effectiveness as it has. But for the time being, we see a regionalization, maybe even a balkanization at least of trade, but also like rules and regulation. And if I would be a business, this is something I need to keep in mind. It's gonna get, as Dr. Sampan said, just more headaches out there. You know, the world is no longer a single space, but you want to go to this market, they mean I have these standards, that means your products have these specifics, a new regulation, etc. Very, very complicated. I think that's the new normal. At the same time, our ability to tackle global challenges, be it climate change, be it pandemics, just decreases. Because at the very time that we are living in a global world, the multilateral governance structure that we had is falling apart, and that makes collective action very, very difficult. Some questions like debt relief for developing countries are so difficult because there is simply no global governance structure that allows you to tackle that. I mean, for instance, the biggest donors and creditors of our time, Saudi Arabia, China, and India, are not in the Paris Club. So how are you going to negotiate debt relief if you don't have a forum where everyone is actually on the table? So big questions from AI regulation, climate change, but also, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of in the air, and they're kind of hostage to geopolitical competition. And finally, we see a breakdown of global public goods from all sides. I mean, it's like, of course, ideologically charged, but probably the blue team is going to say China is not respecting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. At the same time, the US is also refusing to provide global public goods and withdraws from the UN and other multilateral organizations. So that means, in sum, it's not only the geopolitical competition in itself that is disrupting the field, but also the architecture, the umbrella, the framework of rules, standards, and regulation is tumbling down, and the fora, the platforms, the tables around which we gather to discuss these things and make collective decisions are paralyzed or disappearing. And that is a pretty grim picture. Of course, you know, there will be something else. There will be a new world order. But, you know, as a European, I want to add the last order that collapsed, which was Pax Britannica. That started in 1914, and it basically ended in the 1980s. So that means an order doesn't collapse overnight. It can take decades. It will cause disruptions. It may cause a lot of wars. And I think that is something that may come if we cannot find a way together to see that we build an international order that is acceptable for everyone. Sorry for being so grim. I think we're all dressed to the occasion, but I think it is pretty much a depressing picture that we're looking at. And I really wish you lots of luck for the discussions over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marc, for that very informative keynote address. We now